What's up guys, welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, we're going to share 3 different swim bait retrieves that will take your winter bass fishing to the next level. Let's get into it. For my swim bait retrieve, I'm going to talk about how I target suspended bass with swim baits that are schooled up around shad. I've developed a retrieve with a really big swim bait with a heavy head like this, and actually a tiny swim bait also with a pretty heavy head to trigger bass that are really keyed in on shad. The situation I usually find myself in when I use this retrieve is that I'm out over open water, whether that's over a creek channel or a ditch or a drain, and the bass are chasing schools of shad out in the middle of nowhere. These can be schools of gizzard shad, threadfin shad, blueback herring, depends on the lake you're on. And what you'll do is you'll graph around in the center of creeks, in the center of ditches with your 2D sonar, side imaging and dialed imaging to find these schools of bait fish. Then I like to use my Garmin live scope to actually follow around these schools of bait fish the best I can and wait until a school of bass shows up and starts feeding on these shad. These wolf packs of bass will be anywhere from maybe 4 to 8 fish big, and the goal is you want to actually see those bass underneath the shad, corralling them and herding them towards the surface of the water. This usually happens a lot more later in the day, let's say afternoon, but you can also see these bass chasing these bait fish out in 30, 40, 50 feet of water in the mornings, so it really just kind of depends on the time of day or where the bass will position in the water column. So for example, with the big swim bait, I'm going to be using a Blade Runner Spin Tricks 1 ounce underspin head with a Megabass 6-inch Magdraft Freestyle swim bait. This is a big bait, and it's a bait that I found catches really big fish in the wintertime when the bass are keyed on gizzard shad. Gizzard shad can get as large as 8 to 10 inches long on my lakes, and when those bass are keyed in those bigger shad, a bigger swim bait will get those fish to bite. Because this is a pretty beefy swim bait and has a lot of action, you need a heavier head to, 1, get that bait down to depth quickly, but also keep it down there as you're reeling it. Now, if I'm going with a smaller swim bait and the bass are keyed on smaller threadfin shad, or just small bait in general, I'm gonna go with this 2.8-inch Megabass Hasdong shad. It's a tiny little swim bait, and you pair that with a 3/8 ounce 4x4 tackle swim bait head with a 1/0 hook. It's a small little hook, but a heavy head, 3/8 ounce. And this will allow you, again, to get that bait down to depth very quickly, keep it at depth, but more importantly, it allows you to use the retrieve I'm about to share. Basically, my retrieve is getting that bait out over the top of the fish, let's say 2 to 3 feet above the level of the fish, burning my reel handle 3 or 4 times to pop that bait up in the water column, and then pause it and let that bait glide and fall through the bass. I'll then burn my reel handle again to pop that bait through those school of fish, let it fall back down through them, and repeat that process 2 to 3 times. The combination of the heavy head will cause that bait to fall pretty quickly, generating a reaction strike out of the fish, and also it'll allow you to actually get that bait down to the fish on live scope very, very easily, because it'll fall at a good rate and you won't miss the fish by having them swim out of your range. The heavier the head, honestly, the better. I've found that if I go up even to like 1.25 ounces or 1 1/2 ounce heads, I can even get more reaction strikes out of these fish. And all you're doing is generating a reaction strike with this bite. One thing that guys don't understand a lot of times with these swimbait fish is that they will bite very aggressively even when the water temperatures are in the low 40s. The reason for that is because they're actively and aggressively feeding on those bait fish. Now, if the bass were just kind of suspended around a stump or a log or a brush pile, those bass are not going to be nearly as aggressive, and using this retrieve won't work as well. The key is finding those bass that are in that moment feeding on bait fish. They're actively feeding, and when you do that burn and stop retrieve, burning the swim bait over the top of the fish, letting it fall through them, burning it through them, that's your retrieve, and it will generate some of the biggest strikes from the biggest bass in that school. If you just slowly reel that bait through those fish, you're not really going to differentiate your bait from the other bait fish in the area. You're just not going to get those big fish to trigger. So go to a heavier head, a really big swim bait if you're on big bait, or a really small swim bait if you're on the smaller bait, and burn that reel handle, and you're going to be catching some really big fish. Really quick, I want to give a huge shout out to the main sponsor of the Bass Fishing Declassified YouTube channel, Bridgeford Foods. Bridgeford makes some of the tastiest and softest beef jerky on the market. It's a great snack to take on the boat with you, and I always have a bag in the glove box or one of my compartments with me at all times. I spend a lot of time graphing when I'm out in the lake, 3 to 4 hours a day at times, and you'll get hungry when you're out there, so having a protein-rich snack will make sure that you're not hungry and you can stay focused on staring at the fish finder or making casts, whatever you're doing out there on the lake. If you want to try some Bridgeford beef jerky yourself, make sure to enter into our Bridgeford beef jerky giveaway this week. Every week, Bridgeford gives away a free case that's 12 packages of Bridgeford beef jerky to one lucky commenter in the comment section below. All you need to do is let us know what your favorite tip from this video was in the comments, and then we're going to randomly draw one of those comments to win the case of Bridgeford beef jerky. If you don't manage to win the giveaway, don't worry, you can also pick up Bridgeford beef jerky at your local dollar stores, Walmarts, or gas station. Make sure to try some Bridgeford beef jerky next time you see it at the store. Now back to the video.
All right, everybody, so it's January on the Tennessee River system. So lakes like Chickamauga, Guntersville, Wheeler Lake, Pickwick, all these different lakes on the Tennessee River, and even some of them that are very, very similar to the TVA, you know, like the Coosa River or something like that. You've got a lot of shad movement. The fish are really keyed in on shad. They really haven't started focusing so much on crawfish this time of year, so there's still a huge population of bass that are hyper-focused on shad. So one of the things that I do during January as far as my swim bait fishing that's a little bit different than the rest of the year, you know, I'll throw bigger swim baits, you know, those swim baits that get 6 inches plus, you know, around the spawn or even into the summertime. But this time of year, a 5-inch swim bait is about as big as I get on the Tennessee River. So this right here is the Z-Man Diesel Minnows. This is the 5-inch version. I've got it on the weighted Hayabusa 958 hook. This is a great hook, and I end up customizing it because if you've ever fished Elastec before, it's very, very hard to get a corkscrew keeper on with Elastec. So I end up taking off one of those spikes that you get with the TRD spins, okay? And I end up just replacing the corkscrew on the 958 and using that. This is the best way to keep your Elastecs on a swim bait hook. But in general, I want smaller swim baits, okay? So the 5-inch Diesel Minnows, this one's really, really good if you have slightly bigger shad. You know, if I'm going down to Guntersville, which generally has bigger bait fish than Chickamauga this time of year, I like to throw the 5-inch version, and I'm essentially just fishing this like I would a chatterbait, a swim jig, or a spinnerbait, just covering water and using a straight retrieve. Nice, slow to moderate retrieve, just nothing special. You're not really imparting any action. This time of year, the fish are very, very, you know, inactive. You know, their strike zone's a lot smaller. The bait fish are a lot slower and sluggish, so you want to imitate, you know, that type of temperament. So you're just essentially just reeling it in, nice and slow, nice and steady, and that seems to be the best retrieve for me. So I've got the 5-inch version. This is a really, really good one this time of year, and I fish this on heavier tackle. I'm generally gonna be throwing it on medium heavy rod. This right here is the Fitzgerald 7.3 medium heavy. Let's see if we could, there we go, Versa series. This is my favorite rod to fish this bait on, and in fact it's my favorite rod for like chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, and all those type of things. And then I'm going to be throwing like 15 to 20 pound test fluorocarbon. So usually I'll throw Seaguar Red Label. That's my favorite for fishing this type of bait. And then I've got a 7.2 to 1 gear ratio reel. This is the FX8 from Fitzgerald. So that is my setup for the slightly larger swim baits. And then we get to the smaller swim baits, like the minnows. So this right here is a 3-inch minnows. A lot of times I'm going to trim off about, you know, 1/4 inch or even a 1/2 inch off of this back to the dorsal fin, depending on the size of the bait fish that I'm seeing. If I'm seeing a lot of small bait fish, this is what I'm going to be throwing. This is what I call the Lake Chickamauga special. I've got more fish on a small little 3-inch minnows with this little finesse size jig head than pretty much any other bait. And I've fished it, usually fish it late season, so when it's colder, but I've even fished it, around ledge fishing time period, May through July. And in general, the same type of retrieve seems to work during the winter time than with the 5-inch swim bait. I like a slow, steady retrieve. Just keep that rod tip kind of, pointed at a 45-degree angle. Just keep it up and just slow roll it around, the last remaining grass of the year, or just current breaks. Okay, so just really steady, slow retrieve, and that seems to be the best this time of year in January. As far as the tackle for this one, we've got a S4000 spinning reel, got a 20-pound smackdown mainline on that, and then I have between 8 and 12-pound test gold label as my leader on that. So that is my setup. Absolutely love throwing swim baits this time of year, but it's all about downsizing and just slowly and steadily reeling them in.
There's a lot of really good ways to fish a swim bait during the winter months. It's one of the best fish catching tools that we have for producing both numbers as well as having the chance of catching a true giant. Plus, a swim bait works great for any species of bass, whether it's smallmouth, largemouth, spotted bass. Across the country, a swim bait during the winter is a prime bait to be using. One of the ways I like to fish it is not necessarily how most people fish a swim bait. It's to put it on a wobble head and fish it so it's tied to the bottom. There's a couple of reasons I do this. The first and most important is when you're talking about wintering fish, a lot of those fish are in a very lethargic phase. So they are plastered to the bottom in anywhere from 15 to 50 feet of water. And if I were to bring a normally rigged swim bait over their heads, a lot of times those fish aren't going to come off the bottom to eat that bait. They're only willing to eat a bait that's put right in front of their nose, especially if you're talking about in the northern part of the country where these fish are truly in a wintering phase. They're basically lethargic sitting on the bottom. But if I can bring a wobblehead with a swim bait past them, I have a much greater shot at getting them to bite than I do if I'm trying to get them to come 4 or 5 feet off the bottom to eat a swim bait that's in a more naturally used state, meaning it's just on a swim bait head coming across the water column. Now, there's a couple of things I like to do to point out with this. I'm using a Berkeley Power Swimmer. This is a thicker plastic material. Now, you could use a Kitech or a soft swim bait, a much softer materialed swim bait, but the thing is, you're going to beat those baits up more because you're dragging it on the bottom. And a more durable plastic seems to hold up better on a wobblehead. The last thing you want is the nose to continue to be pulled down the front of the bait because then it just doesn't run right. The other thing I like to do is add a couple of split rings between the weight and my hook. And what that does is it allows the bait to have more motion and a little bit more freedom from the weight itself. Plus, the bait turns better and you take away a lot of the leverage that the fish can have when you're fighting them, meaning they come up and jump. And if you don't have those split rings in there, at that point, those fish have more leverage to throw the hook. So there's several things that I like to do about it. But if you're talking about catching wintering fish, it's a very good way to fish. You cast it out, super slow retrieve. You're keeping it just banging along the bottom, nice slow retrieve. And you're going to generate a lot of strikes from fish that you normally wouldn't catch on a swim bait. So give it a try, guys. I assure you, you'll generate some extra strikes doing it.
And that's it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Let us know down in the comments what your favorite tip was, and make sure to subscribe to the Bass Fishing Declassified YouTube channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos that will help you become a better bass fisherman this spring. Thanks for watching. We'll see y'all in the next video.